While the devastation caused by two world wars still casts a shadow on our lives, we have seen newer wars. Are any of these wars justified, or are people being misled by rhetoric? And with the United States leading many of the new wars, have the lessons from Vietnam, Iraq and more recently Afghanistan been forgotten? Were these wars a bid for democracy, or did they have a darker motive? Welcome to The Point, an opinion show coming to you from Beijing. I'm Li Xin. On the 20th anniversary of the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, it's time to reflect on what the war has meant for that country and the world. In fact, while major powers have moved on from two world wars and more bloodshed since then, many are still struggling to cope with the devastation and trauma. What can we learn from these wars? How were people misled into wars by certain rhetoric? And how much shadow do wars still cast on our lives today? In this special discussion, we'll explore all this with Professor Jonathan Locke Hart, distinguished Canadian historian, scholar and poet, who teaches now at the School of Translation Studies at Shandong University, China. He joins us now from Edmonton, Canada. Professor Hart, thank you very much for joining us. So you have said in your earlier writings that the two world wars were European civil wars that dragged the rest of the world into them, and that they were failures of imagination with dire consequences. What do you mean by that?
Well, war is not inevitable, and I think that what my perspective is that we have to work out problems peacefully between people and between nations and others, so that it seems to me that it's very easy for a machine to get wound up when it comes to arms races and budgets and pride and power and so on. And I suppose if all of us are educated in a way that we try to insist that this is something of the past but doesn't necessarily have to be our future, that we can imagine harmony and trying to work hard, sometimes with failures, and not to have conflicts, and certainly not to have major ones, because everybody loses in a war, even the victors, because of the shadows and the devastation that you mentioned in the introduction. So that's what I mean by a failure of the imagination, is that when you and I talk, I see another human being, I hear another human being, and I want to learn from you, and we're part of a family and a community. And just because in the past we failed doesn't mean that in the future we have to. So that's what I mean by that.
You said the two world wars were a terrible mix of prejudice, racism, colonialization, and imperialism and nationalism. What examples illustrate these best, if you were asked to give one at least?
Well, let's just look at the Germans and the British. If you look at the European royal families, they were mainly descendants of Queen Victoria, so they were all cousins. The Tsar was a cousin, the Kaiser was a cousin, the King of England was a cousin, etc. And what did they do? Rather than sorting it out in their own families, they went to war. And they went to war by mistake, by accident, because the conflict, the friction gathered too much strength. So basically what I'm saying is that in some ways there's internal colonization within countries, for instance France and England, where they try to make one language strong, because in England people spoke Cornish, in France they spoke Breton, lots of other languages. So they centralized and they colonized their own people before colonizing the world. And then they got into terrible competition where the French and the British are the biggest empires, the Germans wanted one, and then there's all sorts of competition for resources rather than just sitting down. After all, English is a mix of German and French in an earlier form. They're cousins, they know each other, and instead of sitting down and sorting things out through a failure of imagination, they went to what is the last resort, and that's war. And that really destroyed the power of Europe through two world wars. Still powerful and creative place, but not what it was. So the road to hell is paved with intentions, sometimes good ones, and sometimes the victors or those who think they're going to be victors end up being sacrificed, such as what happened to the Germans and the Japanese when the Chinese, the Russians, the British Empire, the Americans, and other allies stood up against extremism and fascism. So it seems to me that sometimes leaders and others think it's a good idea, or they have pride and will show others who's boss and who's the best, that can end up devastating their own countries and their own civilizations. And in all those conflicts, nobody really won.
In your
The only thing we did do, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, in your 2019 book, Unforgetting Private Charles Smith, based on the diary and life of a Canadian soldier who died in the First World War and whose body was never found, you said there is a collective loss of memory. For example, the Indigenous people of Canada had their identities effaced when they were forced to join the Canadian Army and go into war. You described it as required by the self-serving logic that undergirds the colonial project. What are the dangers of planting such logic into the war, and help us understand exactly this logic?
Well, some of those, you see, conscription in the Canadian Army in 1917 forced everybody in because they didn't have enough soldiers. And Canadians lost a lot of people in the First and Second World War. They fought from 1914 and 1939. The US came into the war in 1917 and 1941. The Australians and New Zealanders would be in a similar position with their Indigenous people, or South Africans with their Indigenous people. So some of the Indigenous people who didn't have enough rights would join in order to try to have more understanding of them and so on. And so what I mean is that there wasn't enough respect for difference and otherness. And that's really what I'm talking about, is a philosophical and poetic idea. The failure of imagination in empires and sometimes in nations is not to treat, let's say, women as well as they should be, or minorities, or people who speak different dialects or languages, and to sometimes think in terms of class rather than in terms of equality, and the fact that being human means that we should have dignity. So one of the things I'm sure that Canada eventually learned, and the British Empire learned, was to be more tolerant and to have perhaps a greater vista. So maybe out of those wars, although they were destructive and there was prejudice involved, that maybe the current societies are more tolerant and open than they were before at that time.
Well, despite the dire consequences of the two world wars, wars have not stopped. Another scene of destruction was Iraq, attacked in 2003 by a coalition of forces under US leadership. The occupation continued until 2011. Till now, there is no correct estimate of the enormous loss of lives, which has continued even today. So how just was the Iraq war? Who should be responsible for the destruction caused? What do you think?
Well, it's very complicated because the Iraq war grows out of the Afghan war, and the United Nations in resolution 1267 condemned the Taliban and Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan on October 15th, 1999. Then the Taliban in September 9th, 2001, assassinated the leader of the Northern Alliance who had opposed the Taliban, and that opened the way to attack America on September 11th, 2001. Nobody would want to have the attack that the Americans suffered. And so a lot of people joined in the Afghan war. The United Nations pretty well thought it was a just war. Iraq, in fact, unfortunately, Saddam Hussein had gassed his own people, had gassed the Iranians. He was a tyrant. I am kind of a peaceful person, so I don't think that revenge is a good idea. And I think that 40 countries went into Iraq. Canada did not. Canada didn't go into Vietnam, for instance. So there are always differences of opinions among allies. just as the Americans didn't go into the First and Second World War when Canada and Britain did. So there are differences. So I think
Well,
the Iraq War was.
I'm sorry to contest there a little bit. I mean, the war in Iraq, despite how you characterize the leader of Saddam, the character of Saddam Hussein, that war has been opposed by many, and still now has been an illegal war, because they were going in there to chase the so-called weapons of mass destruction that was never there. And on the other hand, the way how you termed it, it sounds as if a leader is considered a tyrant, then it is kind of just for others to go in their country and invade it.
Eventually, we'll get to the idea of the just war, which is a Western theory of war. So I'm just using Western theories of war. I of course, myself opposed the Iraq War. 1 million people in London marched against going into Iraq, and Canada did not go into Iraq, and Britain did. And those are kind of, my family tend to be in the United States, Europe, and Canada. So I personally thought it was a mistake. I still think it was a mistake. So I'm not justifying it. I'm just giving nuances. What I was going to say after that was, even though many countries went in, there was a sense that maybe they were misled, that there weren't weapons of mass destruction, and that the Americans had been so wounded by the attack by the terrorists that maybe they made mistakes, that the Afghan war was something that the international community backed a lot more than the Iraq one. And the Iraq one, it seems to me, was a mistake, and perhaps even the way the Afghan war was handled was a mistake. But there's no doubt that any country that had been attacked the way the United States was on September 11th, 2001 would not be happy about it. Now, how they respond is completely up to them. But one of the theories of the just war is that in Western culture is that it is that sometimes fighting with a tyrant is just. Now, whether the international community accepts that, personally, I sometimes have problems with that. So I'm in no way justifying, if in my world there'd be no wars, there wouldn't have been an Afghan one, there wouldn't have been an Iraqi one, and they certainly wouldn't have wanted the people who attacked the various places in the United States.
Do you think people are learning, though, from the lessons of the past, either the failed imagination, as you term it, of the 2 world wars, and the Vietnam War, and the war in the Korean Peninsula, and the Afghan war? Do you think people are learning, especially those who are launching these wars?
I certainly hope so. I always make a difference between peoples and their governments in every country.
Are governments learning? Because they are the ones who are launching these wars.
Right, that's what I'm saying, is look at Britain. They had 1 million people in the street and they went in anyway. And that, to me, is a terrible mistake. And, you know, in Vietnam, thankfully, a lot of Americans protested to the point that it was such an unpopular war that the president had to really find a way to end it, whether whether it was a good ending or not a good ending. So in the Western countries, sometimes the people rise up and they vote people out of office and they do various things. But the optimist in me hopes so, because your children and my children and everybody does better in peace. And I fear sometimes that these machines get wound up and that the governments and the militaries become proud, they make mistakes, sometimes they even don't tell the truth about their mistakes. Mm-hmm. And it's very hard for all of us to know the extent of their mistakes. So I'm sure there are mistakes made in Afghanistan and in Iraq and in Vietnam and in the Second World War, the First World War, just probably every war, the British in Afghanistan, in the fighting the Russians in the 19th century. You can just find all of them. War is a mistake in the first place, but then it gets compounded. So I hope people learn, because we won't survive if we don't. It's almost that dire. Our weapons become, we're not fighting in feudal times with swords.
No. Okay.
We have these terrible weapons, and I think that we have to be more responsible.
Absolutely. I agree with you on that very much. Thank you so much, Professor Jonathan Locke, joining us from Edmonton, Canada.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Let's have a quick break here, and we'll be back with an exclusive interview with eminent American historian, author, and documentary maker Peter Kuznick, who talks about the actual dark motives behind the wars waged by the United States. After the Second World War ended in 1945 with about 75 million deaths, people expected peace and stability finally. But instead, there have been more wars as the US seeks to impose its own political model and ideals on others. Is protecting freedom and democracy the real reason, or are there darker motives? Did the lessons learned in Japan, Vietnam, Iraq, and recently in Afghanistan leave no impact at all? In an exclusive interview, eminent American historian, author, and documentary maker Peter Kuznick spoke to me about what makes America wage war at the drop of a hat. Let's look back, however, at what has been driving the United States to war. At the end of the day, China really didn't have this kind of history record of waging wars, invading others. But to the contrary, the United States really has a very long and very let's say, graphic history of warfare. For instance, in the so-called War on Terror, the United States launched attacks in 85 countries. That's according to Brown University. It has numerous interference in elections abroad. It has been involved in regime changes, and it has 800 military bases around the world. You said in a previous interview that this kind of strategy doesn't end with Vietnam. In subsequent years, the American army intervened in Chile, Nicaragua, Iraq. So what we are doing, you said, is showing how the same strategies prevailed throughout the last 100 years of American history. How did going to war become part of American foreign policy?
Well, that's a tough question. It probably require more time than we have now. But the United States, starts to become an empire in the 1890s. Before that, the conquest was mostly on the American homeland, the North American continent. But after 1890s, the United States starts to become a global power. But the United States did not want to be a European empire, did not want to have armies of colonial occupation. The United States became an open door empire, which means the United States wanted the foreign cheap labor, the resources, the markets. The United States wanted economic domination without what bogged down the Europeans in much of the world. But to do that, it required constant intervention. It begins across Latin America, or begins first in Asia, then in Latin America. With the end of World War II, we've got the Cold War. But the United States has been, we've become an empire of bases. The United States has some 800 military bases. The United States works and trains counterinsurgency forces.
Is the United States the biggest expansionist power, the biggest aggressive country in the world?
It was a secret memo that George Kennan, the architect of the Cold War, wrote back in 1948, in which he says we've got 6.3% of the world's population, but we control 50% of the world's wealth. The challenge for us in the period to come is to maintain that position of disparity. We can't do that with idealistic slogans. We have to deal in power concepts. And that's really what's driven the United States. We live in a world in which the richest 8 people have more wealth than the poorest 4 billion people. How do you maintain that position of disparity? We've got huge gaps between rich and poor in the United States and in China. I mean, this is an untenable situation, but the United States has been willing to go out and, as you say, wage wars in order to maintain its position of economic and military domination. And we've seen war after war after war after war, and increasingly in recent years, we've seen it happening. So it certainly did not end with Vietnam. In fact, the lesson that the neoconservatives drew from Vietnam is that we have to get rid of this Vietnam syndrome, that the American people don't want to keep getting involved in these wars. But we have to dispel them of that notion that war is a bad thing, that military uh, aggression is a bad thing. And so they spent years trying to defeat the Vietnam syndrome. When the U.S. has the invasion in Grenada in 1983, what does Reagan say? The United States is back standing tall. We defeated a couple dozen Cuban construction workers, and we're so proud of how strong we are again. Said the Vietnam syndrome is over. George H.W. Bush, over and over again, we finally kicked the Vietnam syndrome, he said. We've buried it in the deserts. But this notion, and again, we're going to have it now after Afghanistan. The American people do not support this, but the American people are largely somnambulant. They're asleep. They don't pay a lot of attention to foreign policy. And so there's going to be a reaction against military involvements as there was to Afghanistan and Iraq. But the question is, can we build enough of a grassroots anti-war movement in the United States to stop them from doing this again and again? And that remains to be seen.
Yeah, well, that's what I was thinking, out of sight, out of mind. When you don't see the news coming from Afghanistan after a period of time, is it going to be the same thing back again? I mean, until what point will America say, okay, we've had enough wars, enough American sons and daughters have been killed, wounded abroad, enough civilians have been wounded and killed in foreign lands. It's probably a time to think of a different way of bringing peace and prosperity to other parts of the world.
Zhou Enlai once said, the charming thing about Americans is they have absolutely no historical memory. And that's sad. I remember the National Report Card that was issued in 2007 said that the area in which American high school seniors come in lowest is not math or science or foreign language, it's their understanding of U.S. history. Only 12% of American high school seniors were judged to be proficient in U.S. history, and even that was an exaggerated figure. And I see it with college students in the United States when I go traveling around the country and speaking. I did a survey of American college students who are all A students in high school, and I asked them how many Americans died in World War II. Blind survey, anonymous survey. The median answer I got was 90,000. So they were only 300,000 off. I asked them how many Soviets died in World War II. The median answer I got was 100,000. They were only 27 million off. They did not know what World War II was about. They did not know what the Cold War was about. They cannot understand what's happening in Ukraine. If I'd asked them how many Chinese died, I'm sure they'd be off by 10 to 15 million also, as the Americans just do not have historical understanding, which is why Oliver Stone and I did this big project to try to begin to educate people about some of these parts of American history that they're so ignorant about.
How about this argument? Because there are people, I've heard myself, there are people who talk about, of course, who are aware of the losses to American lives and to foreign lives, but they say, that's the price of the Pax Americana. The Americans have spent the money, they've, sacrificed their sons and daughters to bring peace and stability to some parts of the world, or at least try to do that. And other countries are kind of benefiting from the relative stability that America has been able to achieve through military means. So why are you complaining about?
The United States has become the world's policeman, but there are even people in the United States who don't want to play that role anymore. Even Donald Trump, as odious as he was, understood that the United States should not be the world's policeman. I'm not sure what Joe Biden, I'm glad that he finally withdrew U.S. troops from Afghanistan. I'm glad that our involvement in Iraq is much lower, but we still seem to be willing to play that role. We've got the American nuclear umbrella that protects all these people, but the Europeans have become fidgety now. They don't trust the United States. Some people don't trust the United States when it comes to Taiwan. People don't know what the United States will do in those situations. But I think what we need to do, if we look at the problems confronting our planet and see ourselves as a global population, the human species, what unites us is so much more powerful than what divides us. We should be working together on climate change, to get rid of nuclear weapons, deal with pandemics, spread wealth around the planet. I mean, these are crucial things that are in everybody's interest. And why are we not working together on that? Why do we have this destructive, wasteful competition? You talk about America's, lost American lives. That's all that a lot of Americans care about. And you look at the Vietnam Memorial Wall in down Washington, D.C. It contains the names of 58,280 Americans who died in Vietnam. The message is that the tragedy of Vietnam is that 58,280 Americans died. What if it contained the names also of the 3.8 million Vietnamese who died, the million Laotians and Cambodians, the Brits, the Aussies, the South Koreans? It would be, right now it's 492 feet long, those two walls with 58,000 names. If it contained the names of everybody who died, it would be more than 8 miles long. That would be a fitting memorial to the Vietnam War. But that's not the way the Americans see these things. Yeah. And if they did have that kind of memorial, maybe we would wake up to the costs of war, which, as you mentioned, the Brown Project, the costs of war have been enormous.
We have to all have our eyes open and mind open to see the real consequence of what we're doing. But time being very limited, I have to leave it there. Many thanks to Professor Peter Kuznick for sharing with us your insights on the present, the past, and the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was Professor Peter Kuznick. With that, we come to the end of this special edition of The Point with me, Li Xin. As always, follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle Li Xin in Beijing. Download the application called CGTN to watch the show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. You've got the point.